As a philosopher, you're really engaged with these big questions,
Yeah.
right? Meaning interpretation, the very nature of understanding. We're going to dive into something that I think really gets to the heart of all of that today. And it's the world of translating and interpreting Chinese philosophy.
It's fascinating.
It is. It's not just about like swapping words from one language to another. It's really about how language shapes the way we think.
Yeah.
How different cultures might have totally different concepts of truth, and how we as philosophers try to understand different cultures and their philosophies.
Yeah, it's a huge question.
Is a huge question. And to kind of guide us through this, we're going to be looking at the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on translating and interpreting Chinese philosophy.
A great resource.
It's an amazing resource. And for anyone who's not familiar with the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, it's kind of like the gold standard.
Yeah.
It's peer-reviewed. It's written by experts in the field. So we're really in good hands with this.
This is a very rigorous and authoritative resource.
It is.
And it really unpacks all the complexities involved in engaging with this philosophical tradition.
Yeah.
And what I think is really cool about it is it sort of shows the implications that extend to the core of what we think about as philosophy itself.
Totally. And so our mission today is to really unpack these complexities with you. We're going to try to understand why interpreting these texts can be so challenging and what those challenges can teach us about philosophy in general.
Right. And I think these are going to be especially relevant to you as a philosopher.
Yeah, definitely.
Someone who is grappling with these fundamental questions.
Yeah, and one of the things that really jumps out at you right away is that when you're dealing with Chinese philosophy translation and interpretation, they're kind of inseparable.
Right, they're totally bound up together.
Yeah, it's not like a two-step process where you translate it and then you interpret it.
Right.
The act of translating is already an act of interpreting.
Right. The entry really emphasizes that these two processes are so intertwined that you can't really disentangle them. Like just the difficulty of finding the right word in English to express a concept that's expressed in classical Chinese.
Yeah.
That immediately shapes your understanding of the philosophical idea.
Right.
And vice versa.
Yeah, exactly.
And so at the core of all this is language.
Yeah.
And specifically, the unique characteristics of classical Chinese.
Yeah, and that's where things get really interesting, I think, because classical Chinese, the language that was used to write all of these like really foundational philosophical texts, it presents all these really unique challenges.
Absolutely.
And these texts span, roughly the 7th century BCE to the 1st century BCE.
Right, so this is kind of the formative period.
A long period, but this is like when all the big ideas were really...
Exactly. This is when the classical language matured.
Yeah.
And it's important to keep in mind that all subsequent Chinese philosophy is constantly engaging with and building upon the concepts and the language that were established in these early texts.
Right, so it's not like we can just dismiss it as, oh, that was just like an ancient language that no one really speaks anymore.
Right.
It's still very relevant.
Exactly.
So the Seppi Tiferi really points to several kind of key areas where things get really complex. And the first one is the texts themselves.
Right. The texts themselves are not always in the best shape.
Right.
A lot of them have come down to us in what scholars call a corrupted form.
Mm-hmm.
And so this introduces an immediate layer of difficulty when you're trying to interpret them.
Yeah, it's kind of like if you were trying to reconstruct a philosophical argument, but like half the pages were missing.
Right, exactly. It's like a puzzle with some of the pieces missing.
Yeah, and then on top of that, you have all the different people who have tried to translate these texts over the years, and they all come with their own baggage.
Absolutely, and they're coming from such different backgrounds.
Yeah, like initially you had missionaries, right?
Yeah.
Who were coming to China and trying to understand Chinese thought, but they were doing it through the lens of, Christian theology.
Right, and then you have merchants.
Right, merchants and diplomats.
Yeah.
Who are engaging with Chinese culture for more pragmatic reasons.
Totally.
And then in the 20th century, you get the rise of academic study.
Yeah.
And so you have scholars from history, literature, linguistics.
Yeah.
And eventually philosophers coming in and all bringing their own methodologies and priorities.
Yeah. So it's just this really wide range of perspectives that have shaped how we understand these texts.
Absolutely.
And the entry is very upfront about acknowledging that there's been a kind of Eurocentric bias in a lot of the translations and interpretations.
It's definitely there.
Yeah.
And so the entry explicitly points out that perspectives that are really rooted in Chinese intellectual history have often been kind of pushed to the side.
Yeah.
And this Western lens, which shapes not just, the analytical style, but the underlying assumptions and the ways that we go about studying these texts.
Yeah.
This has really influenced our understanding in ways that we're still trying to unpack. Totally. And what I think is so interesting for you as a philosopher is that, we have this whole entry in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy about translating and interpreting Chinese philosophy.
Yeah.
But you don't see that for, Greek philosophy or German idealism.
Right.
And I think that really speaks to the unique challenges that are involved in trying to understand Chinese philosophy.
Yeah, it really underscores how different classical Chinese is from the Indo-European languages.
Yeah.
That have really shaped Western philosophical discourse.
Totally. And geographically and historically, China was also much more isolated than, say, India and Greece, which had a lot more exchange back and forth.
Yeah, and those geographical barriers, the Himalayas, the deserts, the vast distances, all those things really limited intellectual exchange.
Yeah.
And while the Silk Road allowed for some interaction, the deep linguistic and conceptual affinities that you see between Sanskrit and Greek, for example, they're just not as prominent with classical Chinese. And, Leibniz famously called China the Oriental Europe, which is a description that highlights both the perceived similarities and these fundamental underlying differences.
Totally. So the language itself is already this really complex thing.
Yeah.
And when you start to look at the specifics of classical Chinese, the challenges become even more apparent.
Absolutely.
So let's start with the Chinese characters themselves.
Okay. So one of the things that's really interesting for a philosopher who's interested in semiotics is this ongoing debate about what these characters actually are.
Yeah.
Over time, Western linguists have tried to come up with different terms for them. So you have lexigraphs, phonograms, logographs.
Yeah.
And all of these are attempts to capture how these written symbols function.
Right. And so at the most basic level, it's a question of, is the primary emphasis on the sound that the character represents?
Yeah.
The phonetic aspect.
Right.
Or is it more about the idea or the meaning?
Semantic
aspect.
And then within the whole system of characters, you have these foundational elements.
Yeah.
Like the pictograms and the ideographs.
Right. So the pictograms are kind of like stylized visual representations.
Right. Like a simplified drawing of a tree or the sun or a person.
Yeah.
And the ideographs are supposed to represent more abstract concepts.
Yeah.
So you have very straightforward examples like the characters for 1, 2, 3.
Right.
Or above and below.
Yeah.
But then you have more complex ideographs.
Yeah.
Like the character for bright, which combines the symbol for the sun and the moon.
Right. And so even that seemingly very straightforward representation, it's already kind of abstract.
It is.
It's not just a literal depiction of brightness.
Yeah, you could imagine countless other ways that light could be represented.
Yeah.
A flame, a lamp.
Exactly. And so the selection of the sun and the moon is already kind of arbitrary in a way.
Right.
And it gains its meaning through this shared cultural understanding.
Right. It's a convention.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's important to note that pictograms and ideographs, they make up a very small percentage of the total number of Chinese characters.
Less than 10%.
Yeah, it's something like 90% are these things called phonetic compounds.
Right.
And these are characters that are made up of at least two components.
Yeah.
One that hints at the meaning, the signific or the radical.
Yeah.
And the other one indicates the sound, the phonetic.
Yeah. So the example that they give is the character for spider, which is made up of the character for dark red and the radical for insect.
Right. So you can kind of see how those two things come together to form the idea of a spider.
Right. But the entry also says that phonetic compounds aren't always that straightforward.
Yeah.
So like Tao.
Yeah.
This is arguably one of the most important characters in the whole philosophical lexicon.
Yeah.
And it's composed of two parts.
Yeah.
Both of which have meanings of their own.
Yeah.
But neither one of them is pronounced anything like Tao.
That's so interesting.
Yeah, so even the phonetic element isn't purely phonetic.
Right. So there's this kind of deeper connection between sound and meaning.
Right. And there's another example that they give, which is the character for Wu, which means lie.
Yeah.
And the phonetic component of this character is the character for which.
Right.
Which is next to the radical for speech.
Yeah.
And so you can see how there's this historical association of witches being untrustworthy.
Yeah, and that's built into the character itself.
Right. So even though it's classified as a phonetic compound,
Yeah.
there's all this rich semantic implication.
Right, so it's not just about the sound.
Exactly. And this brings us to the concept of paronomasia.
I love that word.
Which is the use of words that sound alike to create new meanings or associations.
Right. And the entry points out that even the earliest Chinese dictionary, the Shuo and Jizi, it uses homonyms and near homonyms
Right.
in its definitions.
Right. So the question that this raises is how important are the sounds of a language
Yeah.
in understanding the philosophy of that language?
Yeah. And that's something that I think you as a philosopher who is very interested in argumentation and the construction of meaning.
Right.
That's something that you would find really fascinating.
Is that, French and German sound different.
Right.
But we don't assume that those sonic differences carry philosophical weight.
Yeah, exactly.
But the link between spoken and written Chinese was much weaker historically.
Yeah.
And so the written language developed its own grammar.
Yeah.
And it really emphasized semantic content over just purely phonetic representation.
And that divergence between spoken and written is something that has really profound implications for how we think about, the relationship between language and thought in ancient China.
Absolutely.
And then you factor in the prevalence of homonyms in Chinese.
Yeah.
Because there are only about 400 distinct syllables.
Right.
Even taking into account tones.
Right.
You have dozens of different characters that can be pronounced the same way.
Exactly.
So the entry gives the example of yi and shi. And anciently, there were more consonantal endings.
Right.
But even then, you could still have multiple characters with totally different meanings that were pronounced the same way.
And this really highlights the importance of context and the written form in disambiguating what's being said.
Right. So if you were just to read classical Chinese aloud,
right,
it would be very difficult to understand unless you already knew what the passage was about.
Right. It really challenges this idea that the written language is simply a transcription of speech.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, because all languages have homophones.
Right.
But alphabetic languages have the advantage of the written form to differentiate them, even if you don't have the surrounding context.
Yeah.
And so to add another layer of complexity, the meaning of some characters can completely change depending on their pronunciation.
Yeah.
So, for example, the character A can mean music, joy, or to enjoy.
Right.
Just depending on how it's pronounced.
Right.
And this kind of fluidity of meaning tied to pronunciation is something that you don't really see in alphabetic systems.
Right. It really makes you wonder if the written language evolved into something totally unique.
Yeah.
Like this semi-artificial language.
Right.
As the entry describes it.
Yeah.
Which is really distinct from the spoken dialects.
And it developed this kind of telegraphic terseness.
Yeah.
It's much more concise than everyday spoken language.
Yeah, and its origins in the oracle bone inscriptions from the Shang dynasty.
Right.
That also suggests that it had this kind of independent trajectory.
Right, because spoken language is always changing.
Yeah.
Undergoing phonetic changes.
Yeah.
But the written form, because it's not alphabetic,
right,
it couldn't really keep up with those shifts.
Yeah.
And so they started using phonetic compounds more and more, but there wasn't really the same kind of pressure to reflect the spoken syntax.
Yeah, and what we think of as dialects in Chinese, they're often as different from each other.
Yeah.
As like different European languages.
Exactly.
So it's really like the written form and the spoken forms went on these totally separate evolutionary paths.
Right.
And this divergence led one sinologist to argue that the Chinese characters made Chinese civilization the culture of the book and not the orator.
Yeah.
And this sparked this huge debate about, are the characters fundamentally semantic or phonetic?
Right. So Creel was kind of the champion of the semantic view. He saw them as being essentially ideographic in function.
Yeah.
But Budberg came along and argued for a phonetic basis.
Right.
And this debate has continued.
Yeah.
And there are really compelling points on both sides.
Yeah.
So more recently, you have people like De Francis and Hannes who are really strong advocates for the phonetic interpretation.
Yeah.
But then you have people like Hansen who really emphasize the semantic dimension.
Right.
And they point out that the Chinese themselves historically organized their dictionaries based on meaning, not sound.
Right.
That's an important point to consider.
It is.
But even the people who argue for a strong phonetic element they often admit that the characters don't do a very good job of consistently representing spoken sounds.
Yeah. It's this really complex interplay
It is.
between the phonetic and the semantic dimensions.
Right.
And it's all further complicated by the historical context.
Exactly, because we know that the earliest philosophers probably did communicate their ideas orally.
Yeah.
And you see this in texts like the Analects, which are full of these sayings that begin with "the master said."
Right.
But the written form developed its own distinct characteristics.
Yeah.
And then there's the whole importance of memorization in Chinese culture,
Right.
which was often aided by rhyme and rhythmic patterns.
Totally.
So, this adds another layer to this already complex relationship between sound and meaning.
Totally. So it's this really fascinating puzzle that scholars are still trying to figure out.
Yeah.
So the characters themselves are complex.
Yeah.
But then you get to the syntax of classical Chinese.
Right.
The way that these characters are put together to create meaning.
Yeah, and this is where things get even trickier.
So if we think about phonetics as the relationship between words and sounds and semantics as the relationship between words and meaning,
Yeah.
then syntax is about how words relate to each other.
Yeah, the grammar of the language.
Exactly.
And classical Chinese is what's called an isolating language.
Okay.
Which means that each character kind of stands alone.
Yeah.
It doesn't have the kind of prefixes or suffixes or inflections that we see in other languages that mark grammatical functions, like case number gender tense.
Right. So you can have a single character like ta, which could mean he or him or her or she or it or they or them.
Right.
And it all depends on context.
Exactly. And the same goes for verbs.
Yeah.
Like qua just means qua.
Yeah.
Whether you're talking about going, went, or will go.
Yeah. So there's this built-in ambiguity.
Right. There's this potential for ambiguity right from the start.
Yeah. Yeah. And then to make things even more complicated, you have the fact that most Chinese characters can function as nouns or verbs or modifiers.
Right.
Depending on how they're used in a sentence.
Yeah. So the character itself doesn't have a fixed grammatical category.
Yeah.
It all depends on the context.
Right. And while there's a generally observed subject, verb, object, word order, oftentimes the subject or the object is just omitted.
Yeah, if the context makes it clear.
Yeah.
But sometimes it's not clear at all.
Right.
And the example they give in the entry is from the Book of Odes.
Yeah.
This is a collection of ancient Chinese poetry.
Yeah.
And there's this one love poem where even scholars who are very familiar with the language, they disagree on who is speaking which lines.
Right.
And they give the example of these three very well-respected translators, Cogs Whaley and Pound.
Yeah.
And they all give different translations.
Yeah. And they all disagree on, like, who's talking to whom.
Right.
And what's being said.
Right. And so this shows how syntactic ambiguity can directly impact not only the interpretation, but the narrative structure and the emotional tone of a text.
Totally. And then you add in this other stylistic principle of parallel construction.
Yeah.
Which is where you have these parallel phrases or sentences.
Right.
And sometimes that can clarify meaning.
Yeah.
But it can also contribute to ambiguity, especially when you get beyond the initial pair of phrases. So it's like you have the style and the syntax, which are technically different aspects of language.
Yeah.
But they're all kind of intertwined in classical Chinese.
Right.
And so the entry uses this great phrase, syntactically overdetermined.
Yeah.
Which means that a single sequence of characters can often be grammatically parsed in multiple ways.
Yeah.
And this is made even worse by the fact that the earliest texts didn't have any punctuation.
Right. No periods, commas, semicolons, none of that.
So how do you even know where one sentence ends and another begins?
Right. And so to kind of compensate for this, the language relied on these things called function words.
Okay.
These are characters that don't really have a lot of inherent meaning, but they have important grammatical roles.
Yeah.
So, for example, you have the character Z, which is used to nominalize a phrase, or yi, which is a marker that goes at the end of a statement.
Okay.
But the problem is that even these function words can have multiple meanings.
Right.
So, for example, Z can be a possessive marker or a pronoun, or it can even mean to go.
So it's like this grammatical labyrinth.
It is.
So how do you even begin to figure out what the most likely structure is?
Well, the entry highlights this observation by Fuller, which I think is really insightful.
Yeah.
And he says that reading classical Chinese, it's not about finding the one correct grammatical interpretation.
Right.
It's more about evaluating the various possibilities and figuring out which one is most likely given the broader context of the text.
Yeah.
The surrounding paragraphs.
Yeah.
The overall composition.
So context is everything.
It really is.
So we've talked about phonetics, which is already complicated.
Yeah.
We've talked about syntax, which is even more complicated.
Yeah.
And now we have to talk about semantics.
Right, the meanings of the characters themselves.
Yeah, and you would think that at least this would be straightforward.
Yeah, you would hope so.
But the entries suggest that it's not.
Not really.
Yeah.
And they use the Dao De Jing as an example.
Yeah, which is like the classic example of a text that is very difficult to translate.
Right, and it's been translated into English over 150 times.
Yeah.
Which is kind of mind-boggling.
Yeah, so the very first line of the Dao De Jing, which is OAC.
Yeah.
If you were to do like a very literal translation, it would be something like, Tao can be Tao-ed, not the constant Tao.
Yeah.
Which doesn't make a lot of sense in English.
Right.
But even just that very simple line, there's so many different interpretations.
Right, and the entry gives you 6 different translations.
Yeah.
By very well-respected scholars, and they're all quite different.
Yeah, and some of them interpret the first and third Tao as nouns, and the second one as a verb.
Yeah.
And so they're focusing on the act of speaking about the Tao versus like the unchanging nature of the Tao.
Yeah.
But then others treat all three as verbs or all three as nouns.
Right.
And that leads to very different understandings of what the line is even saying.
Right. And there's nothing in the grammar of the sentence itself that tells you which one is right.
Yeah. And so it really comes down to the translator's philosophical interpretation.
Yeah, exactly.
And then you have all these semantic variations as well.
Yeah.
Like some translations emphasize that, talking about the Tao as distinct from its eternal nature.
Right.
While others focus more on the following or the treading of the Tao.
Right.
And then even the seemingly small choices, like whether to use a or the, which don't even exist in Chinese.
Right.
Those introduce all these different layers of meaning.
Yeah.
And then should you capitalize wei or tao or dao?
Right. What does that even mean?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it highlights this challenge of trying to convey a concept that doesn't have a clear equivalent in English. And, Dao is just one example.
Right.
You also have words like de, which can mean virtue or power or excellence.
Right.
And fa, which can mean law or regulation or method.
Yeah.
And so while you can sometimes translate those words consistently, depending on the context, words like Dao and De are really tricky because they have so many different shades of meaning.
And it seems very likely that the ambiguity that you find in texts like the Dao De Jing, it's not an accident. It's probably intentional.
Yeah, and if that's the case, then this idea of a single correct translation, it kind of falls apart.
Yeah, exactly.
And there's this great quote from Arthur Waley who says, reading it is an act of creation.
Yeah. I love that.
And I think that's something that you as a philosopher would appreciate.
Yeah, definitely.
Because it's not just about passively receiving information. Right. It's about actively constructing meaning.
Yeah, exactly.
And then there's this observation by Nyland about the sensory experience of classical Chinese. Yeah. The way that it combines sound and visual patterns. Yeah. And this challenges the idea that writing is simply a transcription of spoken thought.
Yeah.
It suggests that there's this much richer engagement with the text.
Yeah.
That involves multiple senses.
Totally. So one of the key takeaways here is that writing philosophy in classical Chinese, it fundamentally shapes the philosophy itself.
Absolutely.
And the other takeaway is that very few translation dilemmas can be solved purely on linguistic grounds.
Right.
Interpretation is always going to play a role.
Yeah, and that interpretation is going to be shaped by the translator's own philosophical commitments.
Yeah.
And the purpose of the translation.
Yeah, exactly.
So all of this linguistic complexity that we've been talking about, it has really profound implications for how we do philosophy.
Yeah.
And so let's dive into some of the bigger metaphysical issues that the entry raises.
Okay.
So one of the things they talk about is this concept of differing conceptual schemes.
Okay, so what does that even mean?
Okay, so in the 1970s, there was this philosopher, Donald Davidson.
Yeah.
And he wrote this very influential essay where he argued against the idea of cognitive relativism.
Okay.
Which is the idea that truth is relative to different conceptual schemes.
Okay.
So his argument was basically that if there are these really different conceptual schemes, it would be very difficult for us to even understand them.
Yeah.
Because we wouldn't share enough common ground.
Right.
But then you have Angus Graham, who was a scholar of Chinese thought. Yeah. And he argued that actually It's kind of unavoidable
Okay.
to think in terms of different conceptual schemes.
Right.
If we're going to try to understand cultures that are very different from our own.
Yeah.
And he wasn't saying that truth is completely subjective.
Right.
But he did think that different cultures can have different frameworks for understanding the world.
Yeah.
And that these frameworks are going to shape the way they think about things.
And he believed that languages that don't share common ancestry,
Yeah.
like English and classical Chinese,
Right.
they're not going to have perfectly synonymous terms.
Right.
And so there will be sentences and concepts that can't be fully translated.
Exactly.
But he also had this idea that if a statement is true within one framework
Yeah.
and it can be translated into another framework,
Yeah.
then that translation will also be true.
Yeah. But the key difference between Graham and Davidson is that Davidson was really focused on propositional truth,
Yeah.
whereas a lot of classical Chinese philosophy is less about formal logic.
Right.
And more about things like naming syntax and rhetoric.
Right.
It's about the art of persuasion.
Yeah.
It's about using language to create certain effects.
Yeah. And Hansen even argued that the primary function of language
Yeah.
is to guide action
Right?
and to shape social practices,
Yeah.
not necessarily to convey propositional truth.
Right.
So for Graham and others who support this idea of different conceptual schemes,
Yeah.
it's really